Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to the MINU Festival here in Copenhagen. I'm glad to be here. In preparation for the workshop with composers tomorrow, I wanted to share something from my own philosophy workshop with you. The question I want to raise today is, what does it actually mean to write music philosophy? Ultimately, such work reports are always stories in which personal experiences are closely linked to theories, controversies, and published books and texts. So I will give a self-reflexive lecture similar to the self-reflexive music piece composed by Diane Richard yesterday, which we heard in the evening. In fact, that I'm engaged in music philosophy is due to a lucky coincidence. It goes back to 2003 when I finished my dissertation, The Fleeting Truth of Art, Aesthetics after Luhmann. Luhmann is a German sociologist who wrote an important book about the art system with the title The Art of Society. As the subtitle of my book suggests, this is a philosophical discussion of Luhmann's sociology of art. The central hypothesis and also my central objection to Luhmann's sociology of art is that the art system is not like a regular functional system as Luhmann describes it by analogy to the science system, to the legal system, and to the economic system. Instead, according to my account, the art system is a reflexive system whose function is to provoke new self-descriptions in the society. While writing The Fleeting Truth of Art, I came across the book Critique of New Music by the composer and editor of the journal Music and Aesthetics, Klaus-Steffen Mahnkopf. It was a Luhmann-inspired critique of new music, and this critique I cited. By sending The Fleeting Truth of Art to Klaus-Steffen Mahnkopf, I got contact with the journal Music and Aesthetics. Until then, I had no particular philosophical interest in new music. This changed in 2006 when I developed a theory model of aesthetic modernity, which came out in the said music magazine Music and Aesthetic. With this publication, I was suddenly part of a new music scene. The text was well received. I got letters from composers and invitations to lectures, and I could write program booklets for music festivals like in Donaueschingen or in Salzburg. The Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, that's the new journal of music which was founded by Robert Schumann, invited me to write regularly for the magazine. The text also earned me a scholarship at the Akademie Schloss Solitude, and within a very short time the text was also translated into English, Slovenish, and Slovenian and Russian. This theoretical model was not developed specifically for music but across genres. I want to present this basic idea of the model because it has been the driving force behind my art and music philosophy for almost 2 decades. History models are needed to reconstruct major caesuras in aesthetic modernism. On the one hand, I assume that there are 3 essential components of art communication, namely the medium M, the work W, and the concept C. On the other hand, modern art results from a negation logic that took off when the art became autonomous in the midst of the 19th century. Classical modernism negated the so-called fine arts by refusing the constitutive media of the fine arts, such as the tonal system and the central perspective. The historical avant-garde surpassed and negated again classical modernism, also by also negating the category of the artwork as a form combination. Postmodernism emerged from a negation of the avant-garde. It negates the once by classical modernism negated media. which led to an ironic inclusion of the figurative in painting or of tonality in music again. And finally, reflexive modernism can be understood as an overcoming of postmodernism, which amounts to a negation of the work category that was suspended by the historical avant-garde. The result of the evolution of the art system in the 20th century is a decoupling of the three components of art communication, which is symbolized by the gaps in the model between medium, work, and concepts. Ultimately, you get more degrees of freedom in art communication to produce and to receive art, which makes it easier and which makes it more difficult to create meaningful works of art and art music. Two phases of aesthetic modernism can also be distinguished: a material aesthetic phase and a Gehalts aesthetic phase. Gehalt is a German word for content. It is content generated through an interpretation. And so I use this word Gehalt because it has a long tradition which goes back to Adorno and to Hegel. Initially, newness is generated via a new aesthetic material, giving rise to a variety of isms that work with aesthetic values other than beauty, namely the aesthetic intrinsic values of the event, of ambivalence, and of the sublime in a purified form. Art here follows the idea of material progress as formulated by Adorno, or progress towards ever greater abstraction as postulated by Clement Greenberg. Sooner or later, however, this paradigm of material aesthetics leads to a point where new isms and abstractions can no longer be found. At this 0 point, conceptual art emerges, with works such as Cage's 433, Duchamp's Fountain, or Rauschenberg's Erased de Kooning drawing. Here, a paradigm shift from material aesthetics to Gehalt aesthetics, which runs through conceptual art, took place. Newness is now no longer generated via the new aesthetic material, but via new aesthetic content, or better, new Gehalt. Historical sequences can be constructed for this theoretical model, which is particularly evident in the case of music. The negation of the medium of classical music consists in the negation of the tonal system. The negation of the character of the work by the historical avant-garde can be seen in the rejection of the process of composing. Musical postmodernism can be recognized by an ironically broken reappropriation of the tonal material. I developed this theoretical model between 2003 and 2005 in the heyday of postmodernism. Even then I was interested in the question how postmodernism could be overcome in the arts, and whether and how aesthetic postmodernism showed symptoms of exhaustion. But at that time, the negation of the work category had remained a purely theoretical idea for me, for which there were hardly any signs in the art system. The artwork was generally an object of deconstruction. At least in the new music system, no significant examples of postmodern art music could be found at that time. In this model, the term reflexive art was merely a placeholder for a fully developed Gehalt aesthetic art and art music. Here you can see the complete historical sequence of sculpture. Historical sequences are always narrowed down to one theme or to one subject. This makes it easier to compare the epochs, so the epochal caesuras immediately become perceptible. This series compares everyday objects which are vessels in a broader or in the broadest sense. In 2006, I did not know any good examples of reflexive art, as they were not as prominent and widespread as they are today. This is a historical sequence on paintings constructed over the still life genre. Here, too, the subject was left unchanged as far as it is possible. This historical sequence on architecture was narrowed down to museum buildings. As I said at the beginning of the 2000s, I lacked good examples of postmodern reflexive art. I could construct a complete historical sequence only with respect to poetry. The different epochal styles can be recognized very well in the typeface of the deconstructed and reconstructed sonnets. Publishing a widely received paper is not yet what one would associate with doing music philosophy. The practical aspect still needs to be added here. This came about in 2008 when I was invited to the Institute for New Music and Music Education Spring Conference in Darmstadt on the topic New Music in Tension Between Science and Technology. It was obvious to me that it is the digitization techniques that will significantly change new music. In this respect, the title of my lecture was The Digitization of New Music, a Thought Experiment. The central hypothesis of my presentation was that digitization will lead to a deinstitutionalization of the new music system. Institutions are needed to provide and distribute resources. However, this also means that inclusion and exclusion rules are defined. You need a music education to be able to read music, you need a music publisher, you need an ensemble to play the scores, and the new music system also includes broadcasting stations disseminating the kind of music. These were the institutional prerequisites for new music, at least throughout the 20th century. With the digital revolution, digital equivalents to all these institutions are emerging. The new technologies create bypasses, so to speak. They generate side passes and detours to the old institutions. And this fundamentally changes the institutional structure of art music. To my surprise, this rather obvious idea led to some anger, even outrage, in the discussion in Darmstadt. I had the impression that the entire hall of 50 musicologists, music teachers and composers were against me. The only person who supported my idea at that time was the composer Omfinder. Doing music philosophy doesn't just mean that your papers and books resonate, but also that you provoke reactions that you hadn't expected. At the time, I didn't realize what I had called into question with this hypothesis. As an outsider, I simply didn't know the unwritten laws, prejudices, trench warfare, and resentments in the new music institutions. In any case, after this little scene éclat, I knew that I had found a good topic. The text of the thought experiment was finally published in the conference proceedings. In 2010, an English translation also appeared in the online journal Search. As I learned later, there was nerve-wracking discussions in the editorial office about whether or not the text should be translated and published at all. In 2010, the thought experiment finally led to the controversy between the composer Klaus-Steffen Mahnkopf, Johannes Kreidler and myself. Johannes Kreidler approached me in 2008 after a lecture on autonomous music critique. insofar as he read my text Avantgarde today. I told him about my Darmstadt experiences, and he showed me his composition program Coit, which made a lasting impression on me. It instantly became clear that in the future people would be composing primarily with instrumental samples, not only in popular music but also in art music. Between 2008 and 2010, both composers published several texts that addressed the topic of the digital revolution, with Kreidler assessing the digital development rather positively as confirmation and legitimization of his own work, and Mahnkopf, on the other hand, who took a negative stance toward digitization and its consequences for art music. The head of the Wolke Verlag, Peter Mischung, came up with the idea of publishing a controversy volume with contributions by Kreidler, Mahnkopf, and myself. The book title is Music, Aesthetics, Digitization, a Controversy, and points to the expanding the discussion to aesthetic issues. It quickly became apparent that it was not just about new technology, but also about the term art music itself. The volume crystallized a generation conflict between digital natives and analog natives, which manifested in Kreidler's and Mahnkopf's contributions. I kept a low profile in this discussion and only republished the thought experiment at the beginning of the volume, and I wrote a concluding section in which I introduced the term e-player. Doing music philosophy also means coining new, concise terms to describe new phenomena. And e-player is such a term in order to describe composing with virtual instruments. However, in a controversial field such as new music in that time, such terms are sometimes understood and received differently than one might think. My idea was that virtual orchestras could not only be used to record scores, but also to compose music that is unplayable by humans, and that large orchestral works could be performed with a few musicians and hundreds of e-players. Thomas Hummels then composed such large orchestral pieces for only 6 musicians and hundreds of e-players. The term e-player was actually intended as a descriptive term, but has come across as a polemic term, because it was immediately associated with the replacement of musicians by machines. I had held back on the controversy, mainly because I had started writing a music philosophy in the meantime. The plan was to fundamentally rethink the transformation processes in art music triggered by digital technology. This book came out in 2012 under the title The Digital Revolution of Music, a Music Philosophy by Schott Music. To my astonishment, no more books and papers have been written after Adorno's death that explicitly describe themselves as music philosophy. So writing a book with the subtitle A Music Philosophy requires some explanations. I have formulated such an explanation in the book's first paragraph, which I would like to read briefly. Music philosophy, like art philosophy in general, is not a firmly established academic discipline. This field of study emerges every once in a while when certain historical constellations allow for it, specifically when there have been significant and decisive changes in musical practice, making it imperative to fundamentally consider the definition of music. To fundamentally reconsider the definition of music. These were the circumstances over 200 years ago when the symphony was established as a formative musical genre, and pure instrumental music came to be regarded as the only real music. It also occurred 100 years ago with the abandonment of tonality, when new music was designated as the progressive art music of today. The event now drawing philosophical interest to music is the digital revolution. It brings into question how new music describes itself paradigmatically, as well as its genuine ambition to maintain a high artistic status. The digital revolution of music is the theme of this music philosophical inquiry. So that is the first paragraph of the book. As you can see, for me, music philosophy is not a normal academic discipline like musicology. Music philosophy can only be written in a historical situation in which musical practice has undergone severe changes. Such phases of a transformation require new descriptions for new phenomena, for which new theories, new terms, new distinctions, and new models are needed. And developing such new theoretical tools is the core competence of philosophy, I think. Briefly on the content. I have transferred the hypothesis from the thought experiment into a deinstitutionalization theory with the help of Foucault's dispositive theory. Foucault understands a dispositive as an interplay of institutions and discourses. This approach can also be used to analyze the dispositive of new music. The digital revolution thus not only leads to a deinstitutionalization of new music, but also to a paradigm shift in new music. That is, to a change in the normative guiding ideas of music. The institutions of new music were adapted from classical music and served to perform music composed in the medium of musical notation with acoustic instruments. And with these institutions, however, the guiding principle of classical music, the idea of absolute music, according to which pure instrumental music is the epitome of art music, was also adapted. The essence of a dispositive is that guiding ideas and institutional structures stabilize each other. With the digital revolution, the new music institution not only lose their defining power, but a different kind of art music also emerges, namely what I call relational music, which includes the relations, that is music which includes the relations to words, to images, to film and to action. The computer becomes an universal interface for combining music with so-called extra musical material. Accordingly, the book contains chapters on both absolute music and relational music. Under the paradigm of absolute music, no Gehalt aesthetic art music can unfold, but this can only emerge based on relational music. Aesthetic Gehalt, or better aesthetic content, or aesthetic content requires information that cannot be conveyed with sounds alone, but only through texts, images, film sequences, language, and theatrical gestures. Doing music philosophy also means making strange discoveries. When I tried to specify the theoretical model of aesthetic modernism for this book, as you can see here in the spreadsheet, I realized that the term conceptual music, which I had used as an analogy to conceptual art as a matter of course, did not exist in the music discourse. In 2012, there was no German dictionary entry for conceptual music, no books or papers on the subject, and the term couldn't even be Googled. Although there were some possible candidates for conceptual music, these works were named differently in new music and were not understood as conceptual music. In addition, musical postmodernism seemed to have been realized only half-heartedly compared to postmodernism in the visual arts. In the standard examples by Berio, Riem and Schnittke, there was, above all, an inclusion of tonal material in the form of quotations and allusions of classical music. But there was no ironic treatment of kitschy, banal or pornographic popular music as one would expect with regard to the visual arts. In the chapter Music Concepts, I had then, in a first attempt, defined the term conceptual music and distinguished it from merely concept-based music, what is something different. Precise terms are not an academic end in themselves. Only when you know what a term means does language not control your thinking, but your thinking controls your language. The book also contains 3 chapters on notation, samples and acoustic instruments. The guiding question of these chapters is how radical the change for music culture actually is that comes with the digital revolution of music. The hypothesis is that the caesura can only be compared to the innovation of musical notation 1000 years ago. In this respect, it is a great time for music philosophy that will not come again so quickly. The chances affect all parameters of music production, reception and distribution in the very same time. Most importantly, there is a new medium of composition, the medium of samples. The digital revolution of music has been well received, including adverse reactions. The book has since been translated into Polish and French. There is also an English translation, but unfortunately I could not find a suitable publishing house yet. The second controversy, which occurred in 2014, was not triggered by the book, but by my attempt to improve it and respond to objections to the chapter on music concepts. The first objection was that conceptual music had existed before, which is both right and wrong. The phenomena existed without being perceived and without being described as conceptual music. For this reason, I had once again taken a fundamental look at conceptual music and introduced a new distinction here, the distinction between historical conceptual music and digital conceptual music. Historical conceptual music has functioned under other names such as intuitive music, process music or fluxes. Digital conceptual music, by contrast, has only been able to develop since 2008 in the form of YouTube videos. I then wrote a text titled Conceptual Music as a Catalyst for the Gehalt aesthetic turn in new music and sent it to the journal Musiktexte. However, the magazine did not want to publish the text without significant revisions. Ironically, the text was first published in Polish in the music magazine Glessander in 2013 due to the difficulties of publishing the text in a German magazine. After much back and forth, I then gave the text to the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, which published a special issue on conceptual music in 2014 with several contributions, including one by Johannes Kreidler, who himself had produced a whole series of conceptual music pieces that I liked very much. This example of digital conceptual music by Kreidler is a nice allegory for the whole discussion. Doing music philosophy also means generating questions that nobody was interested in before. One such self-generated question was, why conceptual music has not been able to develop as a term and as a genre in the new music scene, whereas conceptual art has existed for more than half a century. And my answer in this text was that conceptual music has so far lacked a suitable storage medium and distribution medium. Such storage and distribution media for conceptual music only emerged with video platforms, as a result of which a specific genre of digital conceptual music could also develop, like this example from Kreidler. This issue on conceptual music of the Neue Zeitschrift for Music has triggered quite a lot of replies and reactions. Sometimes they were ad hominem arguments, some used Nazi comparisons and described conceptual music as ästhetische Gleichschaltung. So roughly you can translate it as aesthetic conformity, but it doesn't bring the meaning over. In other words, it was a heated discussion. I wrote a rebuttal with the title Owls, Probability and Nazi Comparisons, which the journal Musiktext did not want to publish. But one consequence of the digital revolution is that you can no longer prevent responses by not publishing them. There's always a digital alternative. In the end, I published the text in the bad blog of music, where such a response fits nicely as a sign of a digital music culture. One experience in doing music philosophy is that you have to expect attacks and polemics if you question the prevailing dispositive of music. Dispositives are power dispositives, to which resources, jobs, and symbolic capital are attached. Accordingly, one also encounters forms of power communication when one describes such dispositives as no longer contemporary. In 2015, the magazine Musiktext sent out an email with questions on new conceptualism to 50 composers and musicologists, to which I was also invited. Usually there are 4 or 5 responses to such general inquiries, but in this case, surprisingly, almost all of those contacted people replied. I published 33 hypotheses on conceptual music, in which I put the essay Conceptual Music as a Catalyst for the Gehalts Aesthetic Turn in New Music into the format of hypotheses, each of which has the length of exactly 1 sentence. Since my thought experiment in 2008 until this second controversy in 2015, over 50 related articles have appeared in the new music discourse. If you count all these radio broadcasts, interviews and book publications, there are even more than 100 contributions. I have listed these publications here in retrospect, that you get an impression. The discussion is remarkable because the last time there was such an intense debate on new music was in the 1950s and in the 1960s, and there probably won't be such a discourse for a very long time. After the second controversy, I concentrated on art philosophy and finished 2 book projects that I had interrupted because of my preoccupation with music philosophy. These 2 volumes were published in 2016. After that, I continued to write sporadic essays on the latest developments in art music without any particular intention of writing another book on music philosophy. Nevertheless, after 6 years, these papers were compiled into a book with the title Music and Reality, Models of Music Philosophy, published again by Schott Music in this year, in the spring 2023. Like the cover image of the digital revolution of music, Johannes Kreidel also provided me with this cover image of music and reality, which is also intended to indicate that these are two complementary volumes of music philosophy. The biggest criticism that could be made against the digital revolution of music was that the book put forward abstract hypotheses and prognoses for which there was no evidence. And indeed, the first volume of my music philosophy was still a great thought experiment by its very nature. But in the decade that has since passed, reality has, in Hegelian words, adapted to theory. Relational music is predominantly performed at music festivals, like here at the MINU festival in Copenhagen. Conceptual music has established itself as a genre in its own right. The Gehalt aesthetic turn has occurred in new music, as in all other art genres. And above all, however, there are now many good examples that can be cited for these developments. This book wrote itself. The first volume, The Digital Revolution of Music, raised questions, the answers to which led to the content of the second volume, Music and Reality. The digital revolution of music acted like a magnifying lens through which the new music scene could be observed for new developments. This enabled me to discover new and exciting works on my own. But I also received such hints from book readers who would point out new compositions and composers to me or suggest joint projects. The Norwegian percussionist Håkon Stene, for example, organized an artistic research project with the title Music with the Real in Oslo, in which he referred explicitly to arguments from the digital revolution of music. 5 composers investigated how music can relate to reality, raising the very question of whether Gehalt aesthetics can develop in art music. I wrote an essay about the project in the Neue Musikzeitung and reworked it into the first chapter of Music and Reality, which also gives the book its title. The chapter on conceptual music is the longest chapter in the entire book. In principle, it is the third attempt to develop a consistent theory of conceptual music. In the digital revolution of music, I introduced the term conceptual music in analogy to the term conceptual art. In the thematic issue Conceptual Music of the Neue Zeitschrift for Music, I distinguished between historical conceptual music and digital conceptual music and used many examples to illustrate this distinction. However, these theoretical drafts still lacked the crucial idea, namely a common structural principle underlying both conceptual art and conceptual music. I had worked out the crucial idea in the 2016 book Gehalt Aesthetics and Art Philosophy, of which I had briefly shown you the cover. In the theoretical model of aesthetic modernism from 2006, conceptual art and conceptual music appears as an art form where the categories of the medium and the work are suspended, and art is reduced to the concept see alone. Conceptual art thus appears to be an aesthetic art form, just as Duchamp characterized his ready-mades. But this does not really cover the canonical examples of conceptual art, or at least not all. For example, Yves Klein's blue monochromes are usually considered conceptual art, although they are highly aesthetic objects. Strictly speaking, the concepts in conceptual art remain perceptible. Therefore, conceptual art consists not only of a concept see, but also possesses a perceptual relatum, a percept P. What defines an artwork as conceptual art is a special relation between concept C and concept P. Conceptual art and conceptual music, this is the crucial idea, are equally constituted by a one-to-one relationship between concept and percept. In other words, it is an isomorphism principle that distinguishes conceptual art and conceptual music from all other arts. I have compiled this collection of examples in the conceptual music chapter of the book. On the left-hand side, you can see the historical conceptual music with examples by Cage, Stockhausen, Ligeti, Brecht and Lussier. On the right-hand side, you can find digital conceptual music with examples by Kreidler, Trond Reinholdsen, David Cope and others. Just as the conceptual music chapter closes a theoretical gap in music philosophy, so does the musical postmodernism chapter. In the digital revolution of music, I concluded that postmodernism could only develop half-heartedly in new music. In 2016, however, I found a genuine example of musical postmodernism, Moritz Eggert's orchestral piece Muzak. This was an excellent opportunity to develop a theory of musical postmodernism based on this example. Muzak is a potpourri of pop music imitations. In addition, the composer performs in person with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra and sings one song after another to the kitschy, heartache lyrics he put together by himself. Here are a few seconds so that you can get an acoustic impression of this kind of musical postmodernism.
See you, and you can really see me, and now I can see you, and you can really see me, and now I can really see you, and you can really see me, and now I can see you, and you can really see me, and now I see you, and you can really see me, and now I can really see you, and you can really see me, and now I can...
Okay, that's enough. Muzak is a much more concise example of musical postmodernism than the canonical piano concerto by Alfred Schnittke. It just doesn't quite fit into this historical sequence constructed around piano pieces, concertos, because it is not a piano concerto. However, the question that had preoccupied me since the publication of Avantgarde today remained unanswered. What should new music be like that leaves even musical postmodernism behind? After all, doing music philosophy means having confidence in one's own theoretical constructs and being able to wait until they materialize in reality. Trond Reinholdsen's piano concerto and episode 13 from his O films are musical works in which the idea of fully developed Gehalt aesthetics has actually been realized. I wrote a detailed analysis of these works in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik in 2018 and in 2020, precisely because these works are incredibly complex and intrinsically reflexive. They also require a philosophical interpretation, I think. Reinholdsen's piano concerto thus perfectly fits the gap in this historical sequence that has troubled me for so long. In the meantime, I also found the missing examples of Gehalt aesthetics, of Gehalt aesthetic art for the other historical sequences and analyzed and described them in detail in the book Gehalt Aesthetics. Very often, the examples were not yet known to me in 2006, or I only understood them later as exemplary works of reflexive art, such as Ai Weiwei's work Dropping a Hen Dynasty Urn, which had already been created in 1995. This also applies to Luc Tuymann's Still Life from 2002. However, Daniel Liebeskind's Military History Museum was not built until 2011. I can go into detail tomorrow in the workshop about how these galactic examples work and how they fit into these historical sequences. Here you can see a snapshot of doing music philosophy in action. At the Oslo Theatre Festival 2020, there was a 10-hour screening of all Trond Reinholdson's so-called Ö-films, which were accompanied by live performances. Between the individual film scenes, I sat on this plank stage and interpreted the 17 film episodes in a hyper-affirmative way. In 2021, Trond Reinholdson and I were invited as guests to the Philosophy Festival Phil Cologne. At this event, I first gave a lecture on Reinholdson's Norwegian opera. This was followed by a screening of episode 13 of the Ö films, and finally we both took part in an audience discussion, as you can see here. The organizers of the Philosophy Festival had come across a YouTube lecture of mine in which I interpreted episode 13 and provided evidence that the Hegelian spirit appears in Reinholdson's Ö films and sings sentences from Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit. Here you can hear and see a short clip from the famous Hegel cantata. So, it was only in German. Das Wahre ist das Ganze. That is the most criticized philosophical sentence, not only from Hegel, I would say even in common time. The truth is the whole. And he used it for the Hegel cantata. In the chapter From Scores to Samples, I mainly looked for new sample compositions that confirm my hypothesis that E-player compositions will increasingly emerge in new music. This was the hypothesis that had caused strong disagreement in the controversy volume. What I hadn't foreseen at that time was that you could also improvise with instrumental samples. Gunnar Geiser, who you can see in the picture, is a well-known guitarist in the new music scene. He contacted me back in 2012 when he read The Digital Revolution of Music, because he saw a theoretical framework for his own musical experiments in this book. At that time, I wasn't quite convinced by his E-player improvisations, until Geiser sent me his one-way recordings in 2018. These are ensemble pieces that Geiser recorded entirely on his own with the electric guitar, and on which he improvises with the virtual instruments of flutes, violins, trumpets, and every other conceivable instrument. After I had written an essay about these impressive E-player improvisations, Geiser invited me to 2 lecture performances where, in between Geiser's live improvisations, I gave a lecture on how these orchestral improvisations with electric guitar work. So I play you a short clip. The chapter Music in Straight Theatre is a philosophical analysis of Ulrich Rasche's production of the play 448 Psychosis by Sarah Kane. I had already seen a few Rasche productions, but I was never really convinced by the stage music, which was usually played by a small ensemble. The bass was too monotonous, the percussion was too predictable, but that's in the nature of things when you have to improvise in a theater performance for several hours. In 448 Psychosis, the music suddenly sounded completely different, namely complex and through-composed, which is actually impossible in a theater, I thought. A composer can't show up to theater rehearsals with a through-composed score, which would severely restrict the director's staging. In addition, a theater does not have a budget to pay musicians for weeks of rehearsal time. Just a short clip.
Für das, was Sie tun, versuchen Sie's. Bitte nicht wieder.
I wrote an email to the composer Nico van Wersch, whom I didn't know, but I thought it should be done something with computer ensembles, and asked him a few questions about the composition process. He had built a construction kit with instrumental samples with which he could compose in real time during the rehearsals. He only alone composed during the rehearsals. These sample compositions were transcribed into musical notation only at the end of the rehearsal process. The score was then re-rehearsed by 4 musicians and the theater's actors in the final rehearsal phase, which was only 1-2 weeks. Here too we are facing a consequence of the digital revolution. New music suddenly opened up to the field of straight theater, where otherwise only music was played from tape or improvised according to standard patterns. Doing music philosophy also means looking around at other art contexts and searching for new opportunities in a digital music culture. One direct consequence is that the small art music scene can attract new audiences. The chapter Music Public discusses this point. The photo here was taken at the 2019 Venice Biennale, and this chapter went into the book as Music Public. So this photo was taken at the 2019 Venice Biennale, where an open performance Sun and Sea Marina was staged in the Lithuanian pavilion. I found the production entertaining and well done overall, except that the music, a melange of minimal music and film music, fell far short of the possibilities of art music. However, hardly anyone was bothered by this in the fields of the visual arts. In this text, Art Music on the Biennale Beach, I argued that in digital music culture, a new playing field for art music would also be found in the visual arts, just as it has already happened in straight theatre. The book's last chapter is based on a text in which I discuss an argument by Johannes Kreidler. Kreidler claimed that a complete transgression of the notion of music had occurred, and that the genre boundaries between the arts were becoming blurred. If you extrapolate this hypothesis, like Kreidler does it, art music could become a media-unspecific art form, which would amount to a decoupling of art music from the traditions of classical music and of new music. I think instead that there is another way for art music to continue to exist than in a media-unspecific art form. An argument that I published first in the essay in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik here. It is an option that is already taken up in works such as the Piano Concerto or the Episode 13 by Trond Steinhaldsen. Art music does not remain in a stage of a dissolved notions of music, but is increasingly oriented towards a reflexive notion of music. First, I show in the chapter of the book that new music in the early 20th century was constituted by 4 demarcations. A distinction from classical music, a distinction from popular music, a distinction from other arts, and a demarcation from the direct references to the live world. Second, I agree with Johannes Kreidler that these constitutive boundaries of new music have indeed dissolved in the last decade or two. All these constitutive boundaries have been crossed in recent years by relational music, by conceptual music, by musical postmodernism, and by the music of virtual orchestras or e-player music. In the third step, I then introduce a reflexive notion of music. The previously constitutive distinctions between tonal and atonal music and absolute music and relational music are themselves handled as distinctions in such reflexive works. The same applies to the differences between ironic, naive, and aesthetic, anesthetic. In this way, art music becomes an art form reflected in itself, and that's why I call it reflexive music. And this has long been the case, and this happens for a long time in the visual arts and in literature, of course. Only with these newly gained internal degrees of freedom can Gehalt aesthetics be composed in art music. Looking back on a decade and a half of doing music philosophy, I would draw the following conclusion. Music philosophy becomes possible and necessary in exceptional historical situations where the entire music culture is in flux and technical, social, economic, and aesthetic parameters are changing simultaneously. In such times, the specific philosophical competence for dealing with complexity is in high demand. There is a need for theories and models, for new terms and new distinctions that are able to describe such a transformation process. If the theories are useful, a music philosophy begins to generate its own material. Theoretical follow-up problems arise, composers show you their new works, and you become involved in controversies and various projects. The other aspect is that you constantly look at the music scene through a theoretical lens. Hence, music philosophy does not only work as a new kind of observation tool for others, but also for yourself, and maybe mainly for yourself, or in the first place. This gives you the chance to discover new works that are considered unsuccessful or irrelevant under the old value criteria, but which appear remarkable and groundbreaking according to the standards you have developed yourself. Suppose the Suppose the works are truly innovative and new in their time, such as Johannes Kreidler's Fremdarbeit or Trond Nelson's Piano Concerto. In that case, music criticism usually lacks the appropriate terms and sometimes the courage to review such advanced works positively. Unlike music criticism, which has to judge everything that is performed at a renowned venue, I limit myself to purely affirmative work analysis and work interpretations. The function of music philosophy is not to apply existing quality criteria, but to generate them in the first place, to generate new criteria in the first place. The best thing about doing music philosophy is that you are constantly surprised by new works, new players, and new places to which you are invited, such as the MINU Festival here in Copenhagen. Thank you very much.